In the dark shadows, in the white cold, fearlessly we search for knowledge new and old. We drink the strong spirits and read ancient tomes, the order of the Abercast. We are the brave and bold.
The Abercast. Occult. History. Conspiracy. Violence.
Take control of your destiny. Understand your past, put your present in context, and know your future with a twist. Check out the designs and watch the videos about Abercast Tarot Card Deck on Advertise.com. When you order a deck, get a free exclusive bonus tarot card. Also, sign into the mailing list to get a free ebook about the Abercast Tarot Card Deck and other bonus content. Visit the storefront on Advertise.com.
All right, welcome to the Abercast. I'm John. I'm your home slice, John Towers. And thank you guys for tuning in. Remember, rate and review on iTunes, newsletter thing in the show notes, and the Patreon. And visit the website, stigmatastudios.com or abercast.com. There's social media links at the bottom. This is going to be part 3 of our little series that we have, the influence of the phallic idea in religions of antiquity. And this is from a book by C. Staniland Wake, published in 1870. So we're just going to jump into it. This is the last third of the book here. Got a lot of reading. This is a bit on the sun gods of antiquity. When considering the sacred bull of antiquity, what the, God damn it. The symbol of the fecundating force of nature, I refer to Osiris as the national sun god of the Egyptians, as distinguished from the Semitic Seth, or Set, who was identified with the detested shepherd race. The association of Osiris with Chem shows his phallic character, and in fact Plutarch asserts that he was everywhere represented with the phallus exposed. The phallic idea enters moreover into the character of all the chief Egyptian deities. Bunsen says the mythological system obviously proceeds from the from the concealed god Ammon to the creating god. The later appears first of all as the generative power of nature in the phallic god Chem, who afterwards merged in Amun-Ra. Then sprung up the idea of the creative power of Neph. He forms the divine limbs of Osiris. The contradiction to Ptah, who was the strictly demiurgic principle, forms the visible world. Neith is the creative principle, the nature represented under a feminine form. Finally, her son Ra, Helios, appears as the last of the series. in the character of father and nourisher of terrestrial things. It was he whom an ancient monument represents as the demiurgic principle, creating the mundane egg. God, I'm sorry about this, my throat problem. Just came out of nowhere. The name of Aman has led to the notion that he was the embodiment of the idea of wisdom. He certainly was distinguished by having the human form, but his hieroglyphical symbol of the obelisk and his connection with Chem shows his true nature. He undoubtedly represented the primitive idea of the generative god, probably at a time when this notion of fecundity had not yet been extended to nature by distinguished from man, and thus he would form a point of contact between the Egyptian sun gods and the pillar gods of the Semites and Phoenicians. To the Egyptians, as to these other peoples, the sun became the great source of deity. The warmth of his fiery, destroying heat wave were, however, not the only attributes defined. These were the most important, but the Egyptians especially made gods out of many of the solar characters. Through the association of the idea of intellect with Amun-Ra, must have been of this late date in the original nature of Amun, be what I have suggested. As a man, however, began to read nature all right and his moral and intellectual faculties were developed, it was necessary that the solar deities themselves should become invested with the collective attributes of the other gods should be formed to embody them. The perception of light as distance from heat was fertile source of such attributes. In the Chaldean mythology, Vol was the son of Anu. He was the god of the air, but his power had relation to the purely atmospheric phenomenon rather than to light. The only reference to light I find in the titles of these early deities is in the character ascribed to Va-Ayu, the later Bar or Nin-Ip, who is said to irradiate the nations like the sun, the light of the gods. But this deity was apparently the distant planet Saturn, although it may have been originally the moon. I would refer to the Aryan mind, the perception of light as a divine attribute. Thus, the Hindu Dais, the Greek Zeus, is the shining deity, the god of the bright sky. As such, the sun god now also becomes the god of intellectual wisdom, an attribute which likewise appears to have originated with the Aryan peoples amongst the Brahmins. They were possessors of the highest wisdom as children of the sun, in whose Apollo and Athene were noble embodiments of this attribute. The Chaldean gods Hea and Nebu were undoubtedly symbolized by the wedge of the arrowhead, which had special reference to learning. In reality, however, the symbol merely shows that they were patrons of letters or of writing and not wisdom in its purely intellectual aspect. If the form of the Assyrian alphabetical character was of phallic origin, we have here the source of the idea of a connection between physical and mental knowledge, embodied in the legend of the fall. In the Persian Ahura Mazda, the wise spirit. We have the purest representation of intellectual wisdom. The book Zoroaster, the Avesta, is literally the word or wisdom, which was revealed in creation, the embodied in the divine Mithra, who was himself the luminous sun god. Leslie's archetype symbolism. This next section here. I have already referred to the similarity between the symbols of the sun gods of antiquity and the natural objects introduced in the Mosaic myth of the fall. And it is necessary now to consider shortly what influence the phallic principle there embodied had over the portions of Hebraic theology. The inquiries of Dr. Faber have thrown great light on this question, although the explanation given by him of the myth of Osiris and the kindred myths of antiquity is by no means the correct one. Finding an universal prevalence of phallic ideas and symbolism, Dr. Faber refers to the degradation of a primitive revelation of the great Father of the universe. The truth thus taught was lost sight of and replaced by a dual notion of a great father and great mother, the transmigrating Noah and the mundane ark of the universal deluge. Noah was, however, only a reappearance of Adam, and the ark floating on the waters of the deluge was an analog of the earth swimming in the ocean of space. There was undoubtedly parallelism between Adam and Noah of Hebrew legend. And there is between the analogous personages of the other phases of these legends. Yet it is evident that if the deluge never happened, the totally different origin from the one supposed by Dr. Faber must be assigned to the great phallic myth of antiquity. It is absolutely necessary, therefore, to any explanation other than the phallic one of the origin of this myth, to establish the truth of the Noahic deluge, according to late American writer, has formed an elaborate system of archetype symbolism, found on the supposed influence of the great deluge over the minds of the posterity, who survived its horrors. Mr. Leslie sees in this catastrophe the explanation of phallism, which, converting all older archetype symbols into illustrations of its own philosophical conception. The mystery of the generation gave the various parts and members of the human body those names which constitute the special vocabulary of obscenities of the present day. But the priority of these symbols, the conceptions, and the question at issue, did the development of archism precede or follow the superstitions referred to by Mr. Leslie as Ophism, Mithraism, and Phallicism, all of which I have shown to embody the analogous ideas. The question of priority is to be determined by reference to the written tradition, which furnishes the real ground of belief in the great deluge. It must clearly be given to the phallic superstition, for I have shown conclusively, as I think, that almost the first event in the life of man there narrated is purely phallic in its symbolism. Nor is the account of the fall on any portion of the Mosaic history of primitive man which belongs to this category. The Garden of Eden with its tree of life, and the river which divided into 4 streams, although it may have had secondary references to the traditional place of Semitic origin to which Hebrews looked back with regretful longing, has undoubtedly recondite phallic meaning. It must be so if the examination I have given of the myth of the fall be correct, since the two are intimately connected at the garden. is essential to the succeeding catastrophe. The priority of the phallic superstition over archism is proved, moreover, by the undoubted fact that even in the traditions of the race to whom we are indebted for the precise detail of the incidents accompanying the deluge, the phallic deities of, Germanico-Semites are genealogically placed long before the occurrence of this event. The Semitic deity Seth is, according to one table, the semi-divine first ancestor of the Semites. Bunsen has shown clearly also that several of the antediluvian descendants of the Semitic Adam were among the Phoenician deities. Thus, the Carthaginians had a god Jubal, who would appear to have been the sun god, Asclepius called the fairest of the gods, and also we read in Phoenician inscriptions of Baal, i.e. beauty of Baal, which movers ingeniously interprets Asclepius assume Jubal. Here, then, adds Bunsen, is another old Semitic name attached to the descendants of Lamech, together with Ada, Zillah, and Namma, Hada, the wife of Lamech, as well as Esau, the Phoenician Usov, is identified with the goddess worshipped at Babylon, as well as Hera, or Juno, notwithstanding Sir Gardner Wilkerson's dictum to the contrary. Her names Hera, Hada point to a connection with Egyptian her, or Hathor, was the daughter of Seb and Nepti, as Hera was the daughter of Cronus and Rhea, the name of the god Kiyun or Kivan, who was also worshipped by the Hebrews, and who in Syria is said to devour children, is connected with the root kun, to erect, and therefore doubtless with the antediluvian Cain or Kevin or Khan, derived the same root, was, according to Bunsen, the Phoenician designation of Saturn. It's interesting. I didn't know that. Even the great Carthaginian god Meleka, who also held in universal honor through Phoenicia, appears, although Bunsen does not identify him, to be none other than Lamech, the father of Noah. Ewald indeed says that both Lamech and Enoch were gods or demigods, and that Methuselah was sort of Mars, while Malhalel was god of light, and Jared a god of the lowland or of the water. The priority of phallic superstition over archism is rather the existence of that superstition before the formation of the deluge legend. It is provided, moreover, by the agreement of this legend with the myth of Osiris and Isis in its primitive form. And while Typhon, Seth, was honored by the Egyptians as a great god, Bunsen fixes the origin of this myth. It is amended in its amended form, so late as the 13th or 14th century BC. In the face of this art agreement, we can only suppose the myth of the deluge legend to have had the same basis, a basis which, from the very circumstance of the case, must be purely phallic. Its explanation is the only one which is consistent with the peculiarity in the Hebrew legend, which is an insurmountable objection to the reception of the expression of the literal fact. We are told by the Mosaic narrative that Jehovah directed Noah to take him into the ark of fowls of their kind and cattle of their kind and every creeping thing of the earth after its kind, every two of every sort. Now, according to the ordinary acceptation of the legend, this passage expressed a simple absurdity, even on the hypothesis of the partial deluge. If, however, we read the narrative of the phallic sense by the ark, understand the sacred Argatha of Hindu, the Yoni of Parvati, the Yoni of Pavarotti, back up off me, which, like the moon in Zoroastrian teachings, carries itself the germs of all things. We see the full priority of what otherwise is an incomprehensible as an arche. The Elohim created the heavens and the earth. So in the ark were the seeds of all things preserved that they might again cover the earth. Taken in this sense, we see the reason of the curious analogy which exists in various points between the Hebrew legend of the creation and of the deluge. The analogy being one of the grounds for which the hypothesis of the Great Father, the central idea of all mythologies, has been based thus. The primeval ship, the navigation of which is ascribed to the mythological being, is not the Ark of Noah or Osiris or the vessel of Phoenician Cabrii. It was the moon, the ship of the sun, in which the seed is supposed to be hidden until it burst forth in new life and power. Skeet, skeet, skeet. The fact that the moon was in early mythologies a male deity almost necessitates, however, that there should have been another origin for the sacred vessel of Osiris. We have the Hastoreth Carnemian, the cow goddess, whose horns represent the lunar arc, and who, without a doubt, was a more primitive deity than the moon goddess herself. The most primitive type of all, however, is the type of Arga, or Yoni, of the Indian Aswara, which from its name was supposed to have been turned into a dove. Thus, in Noah and the ark and Osiris and the moon, we see a combination of the male and female elements. And they are still represented in the Hindu lingam. The introduction to the dove in the myth is a curious confirmation of this view, for the birds, which have an emblem of love and fruitfulness, was consecrated to Venus under her different names at Babylon, Syria, Palestine, and Greece. Send out the blackbird, send out the dove. We have the national banner sign of Assyrians as of the earlier Scythic Empire, whose founders, according to Hindu tradition, took the name of Ionim or Ionius, and which attended on Janus, a Diluvian god of opening and shutting. It was simply a type of the Yoni or Jonah, or navicular feminine principle, which is said to have assumed the form of a ship and a dove. Phallicism in the modern religions. In bringing this paper to a close, I would refer shortly to that may be called the modern religious Brahmism, Buddhism, and Christianity, seeing that these still exist as the faiths of great people, also to the first of these. It may be thought that the real character cannot be ascertained from the the present condition of Hindu belief. It is said that the religion of the Vedas is very different from the Puranas, which have taken their place. It should be remembered, however, that these books profess to reproduce old doctrine, the word Purana itself meaning old, and that Puranas are referred to in one of the Upanishads. Oh boy. While the Tantras, which contain the principles of the Sakti Puji, which are as yet almost unknown to Europeans, are considered by the Brahmins to be more ancient than the Purans themselves. The origin of the ideas contained in these books is a difficult question. The germs of both Vishnu worship and Siva worship appear to be found in the Vedas and are undoubtedly referred to by the Mahabharata. I am inclined to think with Mr. Ferguson that other late writers that they had only indirectly sprung from primitive Hinduism. The similarities between Shivaism and the Satanal worship of the great mountain pointed out by Mr. Hunter is very remarkable. This analogy is strengthened by the intermixture of both cases with river worship. There is no doubt that the Great Mountain is simply a name for a phallic emblem, which is the chief form under which Shiva is represented in the numerous temples and baranans dedicated to his honor.
Are you interested in the occult, history, conspiracy, and violence? Learn more at Advertise.com. Find more episodes on this topic. Sign up for the mailing list for bonus content. Get access to the show archive. And visit the storefront for tarot cards, merch, and books. Learn more at Advertise.com.
Serpent worship in Vishnic custom. Considering the position occupied by the serpent as a symbol of life and indirectly of the male power, we should expect to find its worship connected to some extent with that of Siva. Mr. Ferguson, however, declares that it is not so, and although this statement requires some qualification, yet it is certain that the serpent is also intimately associated with Vishnu. In explanation of this fact, Mr. Ferguson remarks, the Vishana religion is derived from a group of faiths in which the serpent always plays an important part. The eldest branch of the family was the Naga worship, pure and simple. Out of that arose Buddhism. And on its decline, two faiths very similar to one another rose from its ashes, the Jana and the Vishnava. The serpent is almost always found in Jayana temples as an object of worship, while it appears everywhere in Vaishnava tradition. But elsewhere, Mr. Ferguson tells us that although Buddhism owed its establishment to the Naga tribes, yet its supporters represent the worship of the serpent, elevating tree worship in its place. It is difficult to understand how the Vaishnavas, I'm so sorry for butchering all this Eastern stuff is not my bag, baby, who are worshippers of the female power and who hate lingam, yet can yet so highly esteem the serpent, which has indirectly at least reference to the male principle. Perhaps, however, we may find the explanation to Mr. Ferguson's own remarks as to the character and the development of Buddhism. According to him, Buddhism was chiefly influential among the Naga tribes and was little more than a revival of the coarser superstitions of the aboriginal races, purified and refined by the application of Aryan morality, and elevated by doctrines borrowed from the intellectual superiority of the Aryan races. As to its development, the sculptures on the Sancti Topes show that at about the beginning of the Christian era, although all through the Dagobah, and the chakra, or wheel, the tree, and other emblems were worshipped, the serpent hardly appears, while at the Armavata, 3 centuries later, this animal had become equal in importance to Buddha himself. Moreover, there can be no doubt that the lingam was an emblem of Buddha. It was also the lotus, which represents the same idea, the conjunction of the male and the female elements through the higher sense. Perfect wisdom, the association of the same ideas is seen in the noted prayer. Om Mani, oh boy, here we go. Om Mani Padme Hum. Om, the jewel of the lotus, which refers to the birth of Padme Pani from the sacred lotus flower. But also there can be little doubt to the phallus and the yoni. We suppose, therefore, that whatever the moral doctrine taught by Gautama uses the old phallic symbols, although it might be with peculiar application, if the opinion expressed by Mr. Ferguson as to the introduction into India of the Vaishnava faith by the early immigrant race be correct, it must have existed in the time of Gautama, and indeed the Ionism of Western Asia is traditionally connected with India itself at its very early date. Although probably the early center of Ionism, the worship of the dove or yoni, was, as Bryant supposes, in Chaldea. We see no trace, however, that Buddhism proper of the Sancti Puja, and I would suggest that instead of abolishing either Gautama, substituted for the separate symbol of the linga, and the yoni, the association of the two in the lingam. If this were so, we can well understand how, on the fall of Buddhism and Siva worship, may have retained the compound symbol. And many of the old Naga ideas, although with little reference to the serpent itself, other than the symbol of life and power, while on the other hand, the Vaishnanas may have reverted to primitive worship of the female principle, retaining remembrance of the early serpent association and the use of Sesha, the heavenly Naga with 7 heads, figured on the Armavati sculptures. It is possible, however, that there may be another ground of opposition between the followers of Vishnu and Siva. I think it's Shiva, but he calls it Siva. Mr. Ferguson points out that notwithstanding the peculiar phallic symbolism of the later deity, the worship of Siva is too severe, too stern, and the softer emotions of love, and all his temples are quite free from any allusion to it. It is far different with the Vaishnanas, the symbol of the full sexual feelings generally expressed in the grossest terms. Literally everything I know about this stuff is from Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Hamna Shaba, Hamna Shaba. You betrayed Shiva. Siva is, in fact, is especially a god of intellect, typified by his being three-eyed and, although terrible and resistless destroyer, yet the recreator of all things in perfect wisdom. While Vishnu has a relation rather than the lower type of wisdom, which was distinctive of the Assyrians among ancient people, in which so curious a connection with the female principle, hence the shell or conch, peculiar to Vishnu, while the linga belongs to Siva. Gautama combines the simpler feminine phase of the religion with a more masculine intellectual type, symbolizing this union by the lingam, and other analogous emblems. The followers of Shiva have, however, adopted the combined symbol in the place of the linga alone, and approaching more nearly than the Vaishnavas to the idea of the founder of modern Buddhism, Gautama himself, nevertheless, was most probably only the restorer of an older faith, according to which perfect wisdom was to be found only in the typical combination of the male and female principles in nature. The real explanation of the connection between Buddhism and Savanism, and perhaps more, however, yet to be given, the worship of the serpent god is not unknown, even in the present day, in the very stronghold of Savanism, reminding us the early spread of Buddhism among Naga tribes is the crescent surmounted by the pinnacle, similar to the pointed end of the spear, which decorates the roofs of Tibetan monasteries. We undoubtedly have a reproduction of the so-called trident of Siva. The instrument is given to Sani, the Hindu Saturn, who represented as encompassed by two serpents. And hence we may well suppose the pillar symbol of the primitive deity to be reproduced in the linga of the Indian phallic god. But the pillar symbol was not wanting Buddhism itself. The columns said to have been raised Asoka have a reference to the inscribed pillars of Seth, the remains of an ancient pillar supposed to be a Buddhist lat is still to be seen at Benares, the word lat being merely another form of the name Tet, Set, or Sat, given to the Phoenician Semitic deity. In the central pillar of the so-called druidical circles, we have doubtless reference to the same primitive superstition, the idea intended to be represented being the combination of the male and female principles. All right, here we go. Back to phallism and Christian symbols. In conclusion, it must be said that Christianity itself is certainly not without the phallic element. References may be made to the important place taken in Christian dogma by the fall, which I have shown to have had a purely phallic foundation, and the peculiar position assigned to Mary, the Virgin Mother of God. It must not be forgotten, however, that whether may have the primitive idea on which these dogmas are based, it had received a totally fresh aspect at the hands of those from whom the founders of Christianity received it. As to symbols, too, these were employed by the Christians in the later signification given to them by the followers of the ancient faith. Thus, the fish, the cross symbols originally embodied the idea of generation, but afterwards that of life. And it was in this sense that they were applied to Christ. The most evidently phallic representation used by the Christian iconographers is undoubtedly the Ural or Vesica, which is generally the elliptical form that contained the figure of Christ, Mary herself, however, being sometimes represented in the aureole, glorified as Jesus Christ. Probably the nimbus also, its phallic significance for, although generally circular, sometimes triangular or square. This Pisces, this Vesica thing they're talking about is Vesica Pisces. The name of Jehovah is inscribed with a radiating triangle. Diadron gives a representation of St. John the Evangelist with a circular nimbus surrounded by two sunflower emblems of the sun, an idea which, says Diadron, reminds us of the Egyptian figures from the heads of which two lotus flowers rise in a similar manner. These are also a curious representation in the work of the divine hand, by the thumb and the forefinger outstretched, symbolizing the cruciformed nimbus. In Egypt, the hand having the fingers thus placed in the symbol of Isis, and form its accompaniments. There could be little doubt, notwithstanding the mesmeric character ascribed to it by E.D. Moser, that it had an essentially phallic origin, although maybe ultimately have been used to signify life. There could be no question, however, that whatever may be thought of its symbols, the fundamental basis of Christianity is more purely phallic than it is any other religion now existing. I have referred to the presence of Hebraic theology in the idea of God, that of the Father, antagonistic to the Phoenician notion of the Lord of Heaven. We have the same idea repeated in Christ's teachings. It is distinctive characteristic being the recognition of God as the universal Father and the great parent of mankind, who had sent his Son to the world that he might reconcile it to himself, unto himself. It is this character of forgiving parent that Christians are taught to view God when he is not lost sight in the presence of Christ. The emotional nature of the Christian faith indeed shows how intimately it is related with the older faiths, which had a phallic basis. In Christianity, we see the final expression of the primitive worship of the Father as the head of the family, as the generator, as the result of an instinctive reasoning process leading up from the particular to the universal. With which, however, the dogma of the fall and its consequences, deduced so strangely from phallic legend that had been incorporated to the phallic, is indeed the only foundation of which the emotional religion can be based. As a religion of the emotions, therefore, the position of Christianity is perfectly unassailable. As a symbol of rational faith, however, it is far different, and the tendency of the present age is just the reverse of that which took place amongst the Hebrews. The substitution of a heavenly king for divine father, in fact, modern science is doing its best to affect the primitive fetishism or demon worship that Christianity has done for phallic worship. Generalize the powers of nature and make of God a great unknowable being who, like the Elohim of Mosaic cosmology, has some mysterious manner, causes all things to appear at a word. That cannot be, however, the real religion of the future. If God is to be worshipped at all, is the heavenly King, the divine Father, must be combined into a single term, and must be viewed not as unknowable cause of being, but as the great source of all being, who may be known in nature, the expression of his life and energy. And I'm out of here.
Thank you for listening. and we hope that you enjoyed the show. Please send an email or find us on social media and let us know what you think about the show. We would appreciate it if you would give us a 5-star rate and review wherever you find your favorite podcasts. You can find Stigmata Studios, graphic, novels, and comic books at Advertise.com.